Okay, welcome to the ITS seminar this week. We have like two great, super great speakers. I'm just so happy they came up. Beside me here is Carol Galante, and she is the Donald Terner Distinguished Professor in Affordable Housing and Urban Policy. We need one of those. And the Faculty Director for the Terner Center for Housing Innovation. And both of these centers are at UC Berkeley. The mission of the Terner Center for Housing Innovation is to formulate bold strategies to house families from all walks of life in vibrant, sustainable, and affordable housing, homes, and communities. We definitely need that here. And then prior to coming to UC Berkeley, Dr. Galante served in the Obama administration for over 5 years as the Assistant Secretary for Federal Housing Commissioner at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and Deputy Secretary for Multifamily Housing Program. Then we also have a second speaker. They're going to co-op, and she's out on a very important phone call right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and give you a little bit of background about her, and then when she comes in, you'll know who she is. And that's Reid, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley, and she's also a faculty research advisor at the Terner Center. And she specializes in housing and community development, and with a special focus on sort of anti-poverty strategies. And this means like including expanding affordable housing access, and things like neighborhood stabilization and the Community Reinvestment Act. She served as the research manager for the Community Development Department at the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco prior to coming to UC Berkeley. So I will turn this over to you, and it's just a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It is great to be here. I have to wait 1 second while I hook this on so I can actually click and talk at the same time. There we go. So it's great to be here, and I am delighted to come and talk to you about a number of projects that we are working on at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation. So I want to start by saying we're not going to go deep into any one project we're working on or one paper, but rather talk about a range of activities that we're engaged in. So I just want to start by giving a little more background. This is a new research center at UC Berkeley, and it is jointly sponsored by the College of Environmental Design, where both Carolina and I are faculty in the City and Regional Planning Department in the College of Environmental Design, and the Fisher Center on Real Estate at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. So we have a lot of interaction with both the business school, the public policy school, and the College of Environmental Design in both our teaching and our work. As Deb already mentioned, this is our mission statement for the Terner Center, and these words were chosen fairly carefully in the sense that our mission is to formulate bold strategies, and I would say I often get the question, well, if it's bold, how can it be actually implementable and practical? And I say, well, that's the sweet spot of the work that we're trying to do, is be both bold and at the same time ensure that we're promoting research and ideas that actually can be implemented at some point in time at the federal, state, local level, and around private sector innovation. So we're not just about change in public policy, but how can we make innovative change in the private sector activities as well. And then the other aspect of this statement that I want to focus your attention to is for all walks of life. So we are not only about the most vulnerable citizens in our society, as important as that is, and as the anti-poverty work that housing relates to is, we're also concerned about the fact that housing affordability challenges are rising up the income spectrum, particularly in a place in California, and finding a way to ensure that we are serving people with our policies up and down the income spectrum. And then last, in vibrant, sustainable, and affordable homes and communities. So we need to have that sustainability aspect in mind with everything we do. So that's the mission statement. We focus on 4, we affectionately call these, this is a technical academic term, buckets. We focus on 4 buckets of activities. The first is expanding supply and at the same time finding ways to lower the actual cost of bringing that supply online so that, again, we can create more affordability. Expanding access, and that access is both financial structuring, so access to credit for people with home ownership. Anybody who's thought about purchasing a home recently understands that it is much harder to access credit today than it was far pre the financial crisis, but also ensuring that we're doing that in a way that, again, is inclusive of people who have been left behind in the past. We've talked about sustainability, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in some of our work. And then last but not least, actually doing evaluative work on existing programs and trying to understand what is working, what's not working, and what kinds of changes you might want to make in those programs to have them work more effectively. So I'm going to take a step a little outside of academia here, and just given my recent leaving of federal government and thinking about the transition that we're having in government at the federal level, I thought you might be interested in my perspective of what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now, particularly in housing markets and housing community development. So obviously we all know elections matter. The other part of that first bullet point there is that we do have a cabinet team pretty much now in place in Washington, but the thing that is really of concern to me is that things happen at that sub-political appointee level and sub-cabinet level is where the work really gets done of making change or not making change and making good change or not making good change. And this administration is very far behind in terms of where the Obama administration was in making those kinds of appointments. So I, for example, started and was announced, by this time in 2009, and I'm one of those sub-cabinet appointee level people at one agency, and that was happening across government. So this administration is pretty far behind. One thing that does give me hope when I am concerned about some of the negative changes I see that could happen in Washington right now is I keep going back to Hamilton. One of the favorite lines of the play from my perspective is when General Washington turns to Hamilton and says, "Winning is easy, my friend. Governing is harder." And I think this administration is definitely finding that governing is difficult, messy, and change is very, very hard to make. So when you're trying to make positive change, as I felt like we were, it's really hard to do. There's something called the Administrative Procedures Act. So all these executive orders coming out of the White House right now, most of them what they actually direct is for the agencies to go back and actually review their rules. That process will take years to actually make changes in many of these rules, and there's lots of ways that people are throwing tacks in the road, both internally in these bureaucracies and people outside to try to stop reversal of certain changes that have been made. So for better or worse, it is really hard to get things done administratively. I'm not going to talk too much about these other ones, just to say that the budget situation was dire almost the entire time I was in Washington, D.C. for domestic spending agencies, and it's getting worse, and I see that as probably the major threat to some of the things that I care most about, one of which we'll hear a little bit more about, which is the rental assistance demonstration program that we worked on under the Obama administration, and cutbacks on that could reverse a lot of good progress, and so that's something to watch out for. Tax reform, changes in the government structures or support for the housing finance system. I think we will see lots of activity on both of these topics, but whether anything actually happens remains to be seen. So I'm happy to take questions about that piece later on. Some of the work we're doing around federal policy, though, is, again, at the Terner Center, one of the great things we get to do, from my perspective, is step back from the reactive fray that you're often in a policy-making position at the state, local, or federal level, and really try to think more thoughtfully about how to make good policy decisions. And so one area, and I'm going to ask Carolina here to speak to this one a bit, but one area that we're really working on is one of the major pieces of or programs at the federal level that support housing that's affordable is something called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And while it's a program that has now been in existence for 30 years, there is very little academic, rigorous research on what is the benefit to living in this kind of dedicated, affordable housing. And that's some of the work we're going to undertake. So I'm going to hand you this little mic.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I was a little bit late. So we are doing sort of what I think is actually a path-breaking survey of low-income housing tax credit residents in California. We're doing both a survey and interviews and in-depth interviews and focus groups. So we're getting both some quantitative data about sort of their experiences that we're going to be able to analyze, but we're also getting very rich information about who they are, how did they get into affordable housing, how are they experiencing it, and particularly how do they think about it in terms of supporting either their economic mobility or the economic mobility of their kids. And we're in the midst of this. We've got about 120 surveys done on 6 sites, and we still have a good 200 or so more to go. But one of the things that is most interesting to me in these early findings is that much of the literature about residents' experiences comes from a public housing context. And these large tower blocks of public housing in Chicago and Boston and Philadelphia. And growing up in those tower blocks or those blocks in the park, that's a really different experience than growing up in one LIHTC building in the middle of a block of a lot of other types of buildings. And we're finding that residents don't have that same sort of identity of being an affordable housing resident, and they have very different perceptions both about the experience of living in affordable housing, particularly well-managed, beautiful units, and they have very different feelings about their neighborhoods. So I think with this research, we're really going to sort of challenge and question some of the stuff that has come out of things like moving to opportunity and some of this research on public housing that may not be quite as relevant to the LIHTC program. Oh, yeah. So then we're doing 2 other things that are sort of focused a little bit more on a national audience. One is this evaluation of the rental assistance demonstration project. And Carol was being modest. This was actually her brainchild in DC. This allows housing authorities that have a very distressed or dilapidated housing stock that has not been reinvested in for a really long time because of the lack of funding from the federal level to maintain the building, to restructure the financing deals and to rehab the property so that residents are not living in moldy, poor quality units. And just to give you a visceral example, in San Francisco, one of the pre-RAD units that I walked into had 2 inches of sewage along the bottom of the floor because the toilet hadn't worked for 2.5 years. right? And there had been no effort to maintain or upgrade or fix the toilet or improve that unit. So what RAD does is it goes in and it allows developers to actually bring these up to code, bring these up to living standards, remove environmental hazards, particularly for kids, like lead paint remediation in San Francisco, and I'm sure in other parts of California, earthquake retrofitting. A lot of these buildings have never been retrofit for earthquakes. And so we're doing an evaluation to see and understand the implementation of this program and to what extent can we actually make it even better. Where does it not work very well? Where are the sticking points in implementation? And then the third is I have a long-standing interest in access to credit, particularly as it relates to home ownership and closing the wealth gap for minority households. So we're going to be doing a series of both private and public sector innovations that could help more families access home ownership, particularly given the demographic and socioeconomic changes we're seeing in this country. So we did one paper on lease purchase as one particular model for this, but we're looking at shared equity programs as well, and then we have some other ideas up our sleeve that we'll share later.
Great, thank you. So now I want to shift focus to some of the work we're doing in state and local housing policy and why we have such a focus on this supply issue. And it's hard not to, if you think about being based in the epicenter of the housing affordability challenge in the Bay Area. This has been an important topic for us to look at. So I'm going to fly through these, I hope, but it's quite clear that many of the least affordable places in the country are on the West Coast, in California, and in Northern California in particular. And, to me, this statistic says it all, which is 53% of middle income renters across the country are cost burdened in California compared to only 26% of the same income bracket in the nation. So, we really are, this is one of the statistics that you don't want to be at the top of the list of, but we are, and that the average home in California, costs 250% more than in the rest of the country. So, how did we get here? There's lots of different reasons, and there's no one silver bullet for getting us out of this problem. I'm not going to go through every single reason I think we've gotten to this. I'm just going to pick out a few of what I think are the most important, which is, household incomes are not keeping pace, particularly for working age families. Rents are going up much higher a pace than incomes are. We've started to turn the corner a bit in the decline of incomes, are reversing, but not nearly enough to catch up with the rental prices. Now, one of the reasons for this in California is we have population growth, the green line, and you have new housing supply. The state of California says we need to be producing on an annual basis, arguments about the number, whether it's 180,000 or 200,000 or 220, but somewhere in that range, we need to be producing to meet our population growth. And I want to just say as an aside, we have a postdoctoral fellow who's doing a lot of work on demographics, and for the Los Angeles area, and she's looking at other areas, her finding is that an overwhelming majority of that population growth is internal population growth. These are people who are already here. They are the households being formed out of families who are here. And so this is not like we can't just pull up the drawbridges, right, to accommodate our population growth. So this is a big part of the supply challenge. Just another way of showing it that those green dots up there are, the most unaffordable markets, and they have the least number of new building permits, compared to other places that have more building permits and less population growth, and that obviously affects ongoing affordability. Not to dwell on this one too much, but to say this: not only do we have population needing to accommodate the growing population and that requiring additional supply, but particularly here in California, and I know I'm speaking to a whole lot of folks who care about climate change issues, we also don't want it in far-flung places. We want to be able to accommodate this population growth affordably in places that are better for the environment, in infill locations, and do that in a way that's affordable. So that's a hard combination to figure out how to do, and that's one of our challenges, and this is a good example. Even when we were building close to the 200,000 units a year back in the early 2000s, that yellow is non-infill single family. So the good news, bad news is a lot of that went away, but it's not being replaced at a big enough pace with infill, either single family or infill multifamily. And so again, just another dimension to the challenges that we have. So couple more points here that we are looking at to try to, how do you come up with solutions if you can't agree on the baseline issues that are driving the problems? So we are looking at addressing the cost of new development and the economic feasibility of doing new development, land use policies that affect those decisions, and the process that also affects those decisions. Yes?
Carol, could you go back to the previous slide?
This one?
Yeah. I'm just curious, we talk a lot about special opposition, those things you just mentioned, cost of construction, as well as policies that impede new housing development. Have those things really changed since 2008? I mean, those all seem like they're kind of like long-standing forces. Maybe cost of construction not so much, but there's always been NIMBYs, right? And CEQA's been around for a long time. A lot of these kind of other sort of policies and construction. I'm just curious, like, what do you see as having sort of changed?
So I think a couple things have changed in that time. So you have the, part of this is the snapshot of the picture, right, in terms of years. So you always have peaks and valleys in construction cycles, and we actually, in this report where this came from, we have a longer time series, and you'll see some of those ups and downs. So part of that is the ups and downs, and we're going to see, I do believe, this is out to 2015, if you were to take this to 2018, you'll see us getting higher, but probably not back to that peak in 2002, 2003. Now, and part of that is, the financial crisis and the access to credit that was fueling people's ability to buy homes at $400,000 in Turlock, is a challenge today. So even if you were building it out there, we don't necessarily have the systems in place to help people afford that. So that's affecting that math as well, I believe. But great question. So we really want to try to address this construction cost issue. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, construction costs have gone up double digits every year for probably the past 4 years. And again, some of this is what we call the hockey stick effect of we've lost construction workers after the recession. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons, but the fact is that this is a big challenge as you're trying to bring supply online that makes it affordable if the construction costs keep going up faster and faster. So what do we do about that? this other chart that just came out from McKinsey Institute is one of my favorite on this topic, because part of the challenge here is that the construction industry, this blue line, has just not gotten better in terms of productivity. You know, productivity per worker is way, way behind every other industry in the United States. You know, how efficiently you can build an iPhone versus how efficiently you can build a house are vastly different. And there are some reasons for that. And we really want to look into what all of the reasons for that are, so that we can try to understand what the best policy solutions will be. And we have a few ideas about how to deal with that, but this is a really important piece of work that we are embarking on starting right now and through the summer. So state and local land use policies are something that we really think are inhibiting. How many people here are really familiar with CEQA? I think a lot of you are. Yeah. Okay, so, you know, CEQA is kind of a unique to California thing. It's not the only land use process that impacts the ability of a real estate project to get built. And this whole issue of we are prioritizing in this state from a policy perspective, wanting to reduce vehicle miles traveled, have people live closer to their jobs, have people live in compact urban areas, and yet that's a higher cost construction type, and you've got neighbors. You're not building on a green field, so you have to deal with the existing residents through a process that makes it very difficult and expensive. So so cities are really struggling with their tools, with their policies, their procedures for how to get projects built or not built. And so we actually built this tool to make some of the decisions, and maybe we could go to the first slide, the development calculator, to actually help make these decisions more transparent and more fact-based. And so we've done 2 new tools, and these are in beta. We've developed this out for 4 cities, and we are close, I hope, to finalizing an agreement with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission to scale this for the entire Bay Area. And then we also are meeting with some folks in LA to do the same thing down there. So if you what this development calculator does, just scroll down to the factors here, is it tries to take market factors. You know, what a developer needs to think about: target return, can you get the land, what are the rents, what are the costs of building, with some of the major drivers we see at the local level for policy. So what are your inclusionary housing requirements or fees? How long does it take you to get through the planning process? What kind of parking ratios are you requiring? And we try to then predict the likelihood that a project will get built based on the combination of these factors. So this isn't just market factors, and it's not just public policy factors, but the 2 together. So just why don't you go down to, we were going to go down to one of the other things here. You're playing with the button. So construction cost is a good one, because we're going to talk about that more. So right now we have this default setting at $250 a square foot to build the building. And based on all these other factors, if that's what it costs, we have a 66% confidence level that this building can get built. Well, if you move that to $260 on a square foot basis, all of a sudden it's very unlikely with those, same rents, same return, same land cost, same fees, that you'll be able to do that. If you move it down, and as we get to talking about how might we lower the cost of construction itself, not fees, not inclusionary, just construction costs, all of a sudden that building gets a lot more likely to be able to be developed. So now let's go to the other.
So just so that it's
Yeah.
clear, when you come to these tools, you can actually move the levers on any one of the factors. And so you can play with the different policy options and see what that does on the project level in terms of whether or not it'll get built.
So we think this takes some of the just pure ideology out of looking at how these decisions are being made. Now, obviously, we need to be sure, which is why it's in beta, that the data sources that we're using to build these decision-making points are the right ones and are done at the right scale to be effective and be able to maintain them. But let's go to the other. So we also then took that concept, and for 4 cities, Oakland, San Francisco, Pleasanton, and Menlo Park in the Bay Area, we mapped their specific planning requirements for parking requirements, for zoning. Now, we only did this for parcels that already have some level of multifamily zoning. So no single family, no commercial if it doesn't allow sites, if it doesn't allow transition to residential. And it's come up with kind of under the scenario, under their baseline scenario, how many new development units could you get. And then what this allows you to do is for this city, say, if you made certain changes, what is the likelihood that you'll get more or less maximum development. So right now in Oakland, you see, fair number of green dots, but you see a fair number of red dots based on, again, the combination of economics and policy. And so here, as an example, we have inclusionary for, you should put that back to 120, which is really what it is at Oakland right now. That work? Yeah, so if you have your inclusionary requirement at 10% at 120% of the median income, you increase the number of units that you can build, then both affordable and market, than if you lower the affordability requirements so low, take it down to 50% and see what happens. So then you actually get fewer market rate units, which actually then generates fewer affordable units. Again, based on the economics of building a market rate project in Oakland at that time and at the costs that we have built in here. So you can change, well, let's see, you've got it down at 40, you've parking ratio back to what it was at the time we did this. Yeah, change it back to 120. So this is kind of base case. Now, if you move the parking ratio, reduce it by 40% in Oakland, you can build a lot more units at 120 and get the same affordability. Now, leave the negative 40% and then go back to, say, 80% of the median income. So, you're getting more affordability if you actually reduce your parking ratio than you might by increasing your affordable housing fee. So looking at the interaction of the policy and the objectives that are most important to you in a community is something that this tool gives you the ability to do.
And this is at the parcel level?
This is at the parcel level, which is why it's not easy to do everywhere. And some communities it's much easier to access the information at the parcel level than in others, just in terms of it being online or whatnot. Yes, I see a question there.
I'm sorry, could you just clarify what parcel level means?
What parcel level means is at the individual property level. We have looked at what is the zoning for that individual. Yeah, I don't think you can get quite close enough on this map, but at the individual property ownership level, the legal parcel, that you're talking about. Right.
I'm just curious, what are your assumptions here in terms of whether or not the project will profit margins, or what are the
So again, it goes back to the interaction between a target return. So that's how we think about the economic feasibility. A developer's not going to do it unless they can get their investors a certain target return. So target return is the first market factor, and then what do you have to pay for the land, and the willingness of the seller to pay for the land, which is going to be based on value under the proposal versus its underlying value. And then what are the actual rents that you think you can get, and what does it actually cost you to produce that? And do all those things together make sense with the various local policies? And you can play with target return. Like if we could get someone to invest in Oakland for a 5% target return, like that would be terrific, and you could get more done. I don't think that will happen. Okay, there's a couple other questions back here I'm going to take, and then we'll move on. So you on the floor. So again, you can vary it, right? So in Oakland, we demonstrated this at 10% of a project being affordable to someone earning what's called 120% of the median income. But you can say, well, let's say we want 20% affordable at 50% of the median income. How likely is it that you can economically afford to build, with no additional subsidy, projects? And the answer is, without a lot of other changes, a developer can't economically afford to do that unless the city's going to change a bunch of policies to help incentivize that to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I didn't see that.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Because I want to make sure I move on. Yes?
Could you just clarify
So ground floor retail, again, in Oakland, in most multifamily, like this building, like if this were retail, Oakland requires the ground floor to be retail. Well, it costs money to build this space, and if you actually can't rent it as retail, that's a drag on the economics of the property. So if you reduce the amount of ground floor retail that you require in a lot of locations, you will actually increase the viability of the project. Now, you can argue whether that's a good thing based on urban design principles and, whether ultimately you might want to have some retail there even if you can't support it right now. But, these are policy decisions that, need to be thought through. Last one, then we're going to move on. Well, there's a range, but basically the way we've calculated, there's different ways to calculate rates of return as well. We're looking at what we call a total project rate of return, and generally, that was in the, say, 11% range. So low double digits. And you have to think about that relative to what else does a bank or investment or the pension funds, what else do they have to invest in, and what are they going to get on those returns, right? So you have to be in a range that they're going to take some risk on a residential development in a particular location. Okay? All right, let's move on.
Do you want to tell them?
Yes, so each of these are on our website. We have a website, and there's a section on our research and products, and you can play with these all day long. And we are refining them. There's a number of things that we've learned in the vetting process that we would like to update in the next round. Oops. Okay. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Carolina now, who is going to talk about some other work we've done in state policy. I'm going to actually take this off. Yeah.
So another piece of our work is thinking about how do we actually improve policies to make sure that this housing get built. So the cost-benefit analysis at that parcel level is really important as to whether or not a certain thing gets built. But if you have a bunch of NIMBYs in your city who shut down every single project as part of the entitlement process, you're not going to build anything no matter how economically viable it is. And one of the things that we've found is we're sort of doing research in terms of the barriers to supply in California. One of the key barriers in California is our lengthy entitlement process and CEQA. And that's for California Environmental Quality Act, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. But these factors really impede the ability of projects just to get approved and done, but they also really raise the cost to developers because there's a lot of risk involved. You can get a plot of land, but you may not be able to say you're going to develop that in a 2-year time frame. You may not get the approvals for 10, 12, 14, 16 years. And as a real estate developer, you don't know what the interest rate environment is going to be 15 years from now. You don't know what the land costs are going to be. You don't know what housing demand is going to be. So this delay in entitlement really influences our ability to increase supply. The chart on the left is a simplified version of the entitlement process for projects. If I had put up the real process, that would have taken me 25 slides in 8-point font, right? So one of the things that we've been looking to as part of the Terner Center work is, are there models in other states or in other cities that we could actually import into California that could have a positive impact on our landscape? And one of these that we looked at in depth is Massachusetts Chapter 40B. This has been a law that has been in place for about 20, 25 years, so it has a good long history. And in a very sort of simple summary, what it does is it allocates a required fair share of housing to every jurisdiction. It says that every city in Massachusetts should have at least 10% of its housing stock as affordable housing, right? So it sets a threshold and says every jurisdiction needs to have 10% of its housing stock in affordable housing. If it does, great. Then it doesn't need to be subject to any kind of things. It can make its own decisions around land use. If it fails to meet that threshold, it's going to lose its right to control local land use decisions. So if you are a city in Massachusetts and you only have 5% of your housing stock affordable, developers who want to build in your city have the right to appeal a negative declaration at the local level to a state appeals board. So if the local city council is filled with a bunch of NIMBYs and they say, no, we don't want this project, the developer can go to the state level and the state can say, we see no reasonable reason why this project can't go forward, and we give approval for this project. So it basically ensures that jurisdictions can't use this sort of NIMBY entitlement process as a way to avoid building affordable housing. And so what we did in this paper is we thought about this in terms of California, and would a 40B-like process in California actually help to streamline entitlement here? And one of the reasons why it's so appealing for California is because we already have a regional housing needs allocation process. So in California, we've already established a legal foundation that every jurisdiction needs to meet its fair housing needs. There is a process by which jurisdictions every sort of 7 to 8 years are assigned the number of units that they need to build to accommodate their future population growth. And that regional housing needs allocation process, or RHNA process, also says how many of those units need to be affordable to low-income families or to moderate-income families or to market rate. We have this process. How well do you guys think it works? Who thinks it works? Raise your hand if you think RHNA works. Oh, Matt, you're going to raise your hand? All right. So we have this process. The problem is that historically it hasn't had very many teeth. Okay, so the Chapter 40B process could give it some teeth. So we could say cities that haven't met their RHNA obligation would similarly be subject to a state appeals board. So we thought this was a brilliant idea. We think that it fits really well into California's legal framework. And then we thought, well, okay, let's see how many cities are actually meeting their RHNA obligations already, right? Could we use this? So what percent do you think we found? 5%. Anybody else have a percent? 0? You know what the answer is? We don't know. We have no clue because we don't collect RHNA data. So we actually don't know how many cities have actually met their RHNA obligation every year. This is how bad the accountability system has been in California for meeting these sort of housing supply things. So one of the things we've been doing is we've actually been working really closely with California Department of Housing and Community Development, which is the lead agency that oversees the RHNA and housing element process in California, to collect data on every jurisdiction to find out how much they have actually produced in relation to their RHNA allocation. So we've sort of embarked on a really entailed data collection process. You know what this is required? It is required scraping 1,356 PDFs from each of the jurisdictions across 4 different tables within those PDFs, and then cleaning and doing that code. And we're getting close. We're not actually totally done yet, but this gives you a snapshot of how far we've gotten so far. And what we find is that we've actually only built about 1/4 of our very low income housing units as established by this RHNA process. And we've only done about 50% of low income units. We haven't even done that great above moderate. We're making about 75% towards these RHNA allocations, but you can see the skew in terms of production, that it's much easier to build rate units that are closer to market rate than the very low and low income. This gives you the same kind of picture, but at the city level. So we've been sort of, doing this by jurisdiction so that we can later hold cities accountable. We're going to put up a good shaming list of all the cities and what they've actually done in terms of meeting their production goals under RHNA. And you can see Los Angeles has the largest RHNA allocation. So the agencies have said for Los Angeles to meet your population and job growth, you need to build X number of units. And you can see how many LA has reached as part of that, compared to San Francisco and San Jose, which have been probably about half of their allocation, and then Anaheim, which has actually done a pretty good job.
Can you talk about the time frame for meeting, so when they get a RHNA allocation, over what time period?
So they're 8-year cycles.
So within that 8 years, that city should be providing X amount.
So there used to be, I think it was 5-year cycles. Matt actually might be better at this to tell you the actual year cycles. I think it's 8. So yeah, and actually for RHNA itself, the jurisdictions only have to show that they're zoning for it and permitting for it, right? Because we can't necessarily tell a jurisdiction, you have to build affordable housing even if there's maybe no funding for it. But it seems that at some point we need to start moving the state to looking at outcomes and making sure that we are actually building the units. And what happens in a lot of cities is they'll zone for those low-income units, but they'll be on land that's totally unsuitable to actually build the units there, right?
So is this chart showing what has been built or permitted? So
Yes. So this is
that shows on paper how much Los Angeles
was allocated. No, it was just allocated, right? So the regional agencies say to every city, you need to do X many units to meet demand. And so that's the white bar, is what they were allocated as part of the RHNA process. And then the colored bars is what they actually built.
But that's,
Yes.
it's trickier than that, you realize, because they go through the regional bodies, they go through the COGS, and then from the COGS they go to the cities, but the cities negotiate the RHNA target. So, yeah, it's a whole other step.
So this is even after all of that negotiation, right? That's LA, San Francisco, San Diego's allocation after that negotiation, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So we could argue about whether or not the RENA allocations are actually accurate, right? Whether or not cities are actually be giving the right number to build towards. We're not even getting to that level of critique. That might be our critique 10 years down the road. Our critique right now is, one, let's even try and move towards that RENA allocation, and two, let's just track some data. But I'm a little bit of a data nerd. Okay. And so, again, we're thinking it's really important for both the public and for city officials to have data at the city level to be able to hold their city councils accountable. And so we're building out a citywide or a jurisdictional level statewide scorecard where we will be ranking cities on a wide variety of indicators, both in terms of the outcomes that they are seeing for their housing, but also in terms of the policy inputs that they're doing. So we're also doing a survey of all the policies that every jurisdiction has that either impede or help affordable housing production. So do they have a growth boundary? Do they have an inclusionary zoning law? Do they have a streamlined permitting process? And this will allow us to start seeing the relationship between these regulations and efforts that cities are doing from the policy side on actual production and housing outcomes. And I'm going to turn it back to Carol to close us out.
So just to end here, obviously there are a lot of policy challenges to ensure that we deal with. The last thing I will say is we are also working on a number of private sector innovations that can move the dial here as well. And the one that I didn't bring a slide on this, but the one that we are most focused on right now is the opportunity, given change in technology, to change that productivity chart I showed on construction by actually having more off-site construction, so construction of homes and apartments not on the site but in a factory and shipped to the site, so that you can actually save both time and money. So you can actually be building your garage and all that on site while you're building your upper stories in a factory, and so you can save a lot of time, which saves you money, and you can actually save a lot of waste and a lot of cost in the actual construction. And we think that that's an innovation that's time has come to be scaled. So with that, I think we'll stop and try to take a few more questions if you have them. Yes.
Has a lot zoned for single-family housing, and I'm sure the rate of return is higher for that product type. That's an assumption, but I'd be curious if you've heard that from developers, and how does that weigh into, a decision on, do I build this type of product that will get me 11, 15% return on investment, or a single-family home on resale that I could reap the larger benefit from. And do you research, how do you look at that? Because I think one of the strategies is to a city is limit your growth boundary, or limit the amount that you're actually allowing to build the single family, so you never get that pressure to do it.
So I think it's a great question, and I would say you really do have to look at it. The interaction between the actual cost of development, so and the price that someone is willing to pay to live in that home, whether that's an apartment in San Francisco or that's a single-family home in the San Joaquin Valley, right? So the rate of return is actually going to be more relative to the perception of the capital and the perception of the development on the risk. Okay, so if they think that they can easily sell a home for $300,000 all day long, and they're going to build it and they're going to come and it's going to get done, they'll take a lower return, right? Than if they are worried that I'm going to build this house and I'm going to sit there with inventory, right? Because the price point is $400,000 and that is above market and no one's going to pay for that. I'm in deep doo-doo and my returns are going to go down. So that's the calculus that folks are making. So that's a long-winded way of saying I don't think capital is necessarily looking at single families better returns, multifamilies worse. It really is a calculus of the likelihood that this is going to get done in the time frame that I've put down in my financial projections and the likelihood that I'm going to get the return that I'm pro-formaing, if that makes sense. Having said that, the single family home construction is less expensive on a per square foot basis, so that does help bring price points down.
So I think it's also really important to remember there's also the market demand side, right? And so I think one of the questions that we've been asking a lot at Terner Center and that we're thinking about doing research on and are doing some projects on now is all you millennials in the room, are you going to choose to live in more urban infill locations and be less car dependent? Or at age 35 with 2 kids, you're going to want your suburban lifestyle too, right? So I think it's really also important. And I think that the builders are also thinking a lot about what is going to be the demand in this next generation or this next set of household formation as to where people are going to want to live.
Or are the costs in all the places in California going to be so high that you're all going to move to Colorado? I'm going to take the one in the back there. Yeah, so great question. I mean, I do think, at least in the multifamily construction context, it is a great tool for the larger developments. But so one thing I would say, I'm seeing lots of startups experimenting across the range. So there are some startups that are looking at this for building accessory dwelling units in a kit type basis. So one of the challenges, if you want to do a granny flat in the backyard, you can't necessarily just lift it in, with a crane. I mean, it's too expensive to get a crane to actually drop it in back there if you can't get in on the narrow pathways. So people are coming up with panelized, pop open the kit. So I think this technology gives you a lot more flexibility to also look at small urban infill projects, but it's yet to be done on any kind of scale, but I think it's got potential. Here and here, yeah, we'll do both.
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you. In your calculating out affordability, like 100% of median income, are you considering the transportation costs as well, or is it just housing?
This is just housing costs. We are not considering the transportation cost. And again, in the calculator, it's literally based on the area median income for that jurisdiction, because that's how most of these inclusionary zoning or fees would work. So that's what.
Interesting to include that, because then it could make households could afford to pay more in urban areas that are considering the costs.
We have done some of that work in this paper that we just did called, right? right place, right type. I always can't remember which goes first. Where we actually do show that while it's more expensive to build an urban infill and more expensive to rent, if you consider the transportation costs and the unit cost versus the per square foot cost, you can actually get to an affordability benefit that way. Yes, and then I'm going to go over here. So part of my response is that there's truth to the fact that in any micro location, there is a potential that more development increases the demand in that location, so induced demand as a result of that development. On a statewide or a regional basis, however, there's no doubt that more supply overall will equal more affordability overall. And so there's a tension between that individual jurisdiction or that individual neighborhood parcel level and the broader concerns of the region. So I think looking at policies in neighborhoods is important, but we shouldn't lose sight of development overall.
So I think we'll take one more question, then they've got to head back.
I think it's too early. I don't know if anybody else has the answer to the question, but I think it's way too early to tell. I don't even think the final guidelines are out on how that's going to work. Sure. How about someone on the floor down there who I can't see? Yeah, so on the first run, on the SB 375 CEQA streamlining, we actually did some work on that and talked to every one of the MPOs and tried to find proper projects, and the state tried to find projects that had used the CEQA streamlining, and I think we found one that's used the CEQA streamlining. And what we heard, which mirrors what I've heard anecdotally, is there's a lot of steps you still need to go through to qualify for that infill exemption. So there's a classic project that we use as an example in downtown Berkeley. It's in a high priority development area. It meets, most of the criteria, but there's an historic building next door. X doesn't, you have to go through the historic. So, there's so many restrictions on the use of that infill. And, I can tell you, I think if you could simplify that CEQA infill exemption and make it a statutory CEQA exemption, that would make a difference. And the other question?
So I think the other question is excellent, and that's the direction we want to go. At the moment, because 50% of cities don't even report their required annual progress reports on their RENA allocations, it's actually it's almost impossible to tie a financial carrot to it. There was a really interesting parks program where you could get money to help do park improvements that would also go towards affordable housing in that jurisdiction, and you were only eligible for that grant program if you actually filled out your annual progress report. So, and the state is considering other mechanisms that is just going to, in the first instance, to get states or to get cities to comply with reporting requirements, and that was actually really effective. And so we're looking to that first, but I think down the road, that's a brilliant suggestion, right? Like, let's tie funding to how well people are doing towards their arena. That's right, but they are required to report how many they have permitted and built. Yeah.
Okay, so that's it. We're going to send them back to Berkeley. Thank you.